My name is Eric Fine. I'm here in New Haven, Connecticut at the Yale program on climate change communication. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. This talk is sponsored by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication, Yale Environment 360, and the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. Based at Yale University School of the Environment, the Center for Environmental Communication, we focus on 4 areas: research, teaching, convening a global network of environmental scholars and practitioners, and engaging the public through environmental journalism. We have a climate-focused news service called Yale Climate Connections, which includes a short daily radio story that airs on more than 680 radio stations, mostly in the US and some abroad, and Yale Environment 360, which offers news, analysis, and debate on global environmental issues, which one of the speakers today, Fred Pierce, he frequently writes for them. On the research side, just one data point relevant for today's discussion. In a recent survey of public opinion conducted in 31 countries by the Yale program on climate change communication, as well as Facebook Data for Good, we found that there is overwhelming support for the Paris Accord internationally. As far as logistics, the chat is closed. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and be aware that you'll only see the questions you ask. We have folks monitoring the questions, so be assured your question will be seen. Today, we will be using Chatham House rules, meaning you are free to use information from the discussion, but you may not attribute it to any participant or speaker, nor say where you obtained it. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Megan Kirscher of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, another sponsor of today's event.
Thank you. I'm a fellow at the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and I attended COP26 alongside Dan Esty, our center's director. So I'm really excited for the conversation today. Today's talk will be moderated by Mr. David Wade. David Wade is a lecturer at Yale University, where he also directs the CARI Initiative, and a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he works on global climate change, global oceans, and foreign policy issues. He spent over 2 decades at the highest levels of the State Department on Capitol Hill and on 2 national presidential campaigns, and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So David, I will let you take the mic.
Megan, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for being here this morning. And thanks in particular to the Yale Center for Environmental Communication for helping to sort of dive into this challenge of how we communicate about climate change and how we strike the right balance between talking enough about science to convey urgency, but also how we talk about solutions in a way that create a sense of optimism and a sense of possibilities. We could not have 2 better conversationalists for this topic than Sue, Biniaz, and Fred. Sue, as many of you know from being a part of the Yale community, is a senior fellow and a lecturer at the Jackson Institute. For those of us who've been a part of the State Department family, there are 2 movies that come to mind when I think of her latest stint back in the State Department. There's the great scene in Godfather 3 when Michael Corleone says, "Just when I think I'm out, they keep pulling me back in." And then there's a scene in the Blues Brothers when they say, "We've got to get the band back together." When former Secretary of State John Kerry was tapped by President Biden to be the first ever special presidential envoy for climate, his very first call was to Sue Biniaz to ask her if she would help him get the band back together and if she would be willing to come in as deputy envoy. Sue, as anybody who knows the State Department knows, she was a deputy legal advisor at the State Department. And for more than 25 years, she was the lead climate lawyer for the United States government. She played a central role in all the major environmental climate negotiations, including the landmark Paris Climate Accord. And it played incredible role and a very difficult assignment coming back into government for the road to Glasgow and now for the road ahead. And we are also lucky to be joined by Fred Pierce, who's a freelance author, a journalist. He's based in the UK, a contributing writer, as was mentioned, for Yale Environment 360, and the author of a whole slew of books that are very relevant to our discussion today. The Land Grabbers, Earth Then and Now, Amazing Images of Our Changing World. And one title that especially speaks to what we're talking about in this discussion, The Climate Files, The Battle for the Truth About Global Warming. Sue and Fred, would you like to spend a moment just talking about your work right now?
Thanks, David. I guess I'll go first. Thank you for that ridiculously generous introduction. And it's great to see you, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I thought I would just say, yeah, I am teaching the last couple years, but I think of myself as mostly a practitioner and negotiator, not only of climate agreements, but other kinds of agreements. Really enjoy that world. And maybe just of relevance to the panel today is I've been to almost every climate COP, maybe skip two to have children. A couple I attended on the outside, I guess during the Trump years when I wasn't in the government. So I have a little bit of insight into what it's like to be a member of civil society looking on and trying to make sense of the COP. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Fred?
Yes, thank you, David, and hello, Sue. I guess I've been around nearly as long as Sue, or perhaps about as long as Sue. I wouldn't say I've been to all of the COPs, but I've been to a good few. I was at the Earth Summit in 1992, where nations agreed to stop dangerous climate change, was the phrase that's used, which keeps coming back. It's the touchstone for what we've been trying to do ever since. I was at the first ever COP, COP number 1, which was held in Berlin shortly after the reunification of Germany, where a young unknown politician called Angela Merkel was the new environment minister and chaired the session extremely effectively. And I think a number of us thought she's going places. And they set up the Berlin Mandate, and a couple of years later, that turned into the Kyoto Protocol. I was there in Kyoto in 1997. The first targets for rich nations, at any rate, to try and meet. There was a lot of pushback against that over the years. I went to a few of those, not all of them. Then I was in Copenhagen in 2009, where the world crashed in its attempt to get all nations to accept binding targets. So that took us on to Paris, and Paris went a bit better because we stopped saying that there should be binding targets that should be set from above according to a template of what we needed to do. We had voluntary national targets. People could just show up and say what they thought they were capable of doing. But Paris also agreed to keep global warming below 2 degrees and preferably to about 1.5. And there was a big gap between those two, between the national targets and the actual aspiration, if you like, to limit warming to below 2 degrees. And the Glasgow meeting, the most recent one, was really about trying to narrow that gap. And a lot of the discussion was about whether the promises made there were doing that. So I've watched all that with some fascination. In many ways, I'm really quite surprised at how far we've got in the last 30 years. I think many of us back in the early 90s might have thought it was a doomed enterprise, but well, we've made some progress.
Great. Well, let's dive into the discussion again with two. You just could not imagine two better conversationalists to dive into this from different perspectives and different angles. I was struck watching COP26, watching Glasgow, how from the outside, it was having been at a COP, a COP is sort of like an iceberg. Most of the real action is beneath the surface. This time, watching from the outside, I was struck by how much very different and credible climate organizations had completely different takes on what was happening at COP. What is your advice for civil society? How should we think about how to make conclusions about measuring a COP when so much of it is going to depend on the implementation, and also when there are just so many different and disparate takes on what is happening? How should we think about that?
Well, let me take a stab at that. I think it's a really interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it until this panel came along, so I actually appreciate the opportunity to give it some thought. Let me start by saying civil society is not monolithic. And I think many members of civil society do have a hard time drawing conclusions about a COP, but other members of civil society are experts, have a particular point of view, and they might even be driving the narrative about the conclusion of the COP and be the go-to people for particular journalists. And so some members of civil society are actually indirectly being influenced by other members of civil society in terms of how to think about a COP. So that's just a point I want to throw out there. I think is important. Moving on, I don't think it's easy for outside people to make a well-informed judgment. And I'm going to name 8 challenges, I hope, hopefully pretty quickly. The first one is there are 2 COPs at every COP, right? There's the actual treaty body, the Conference of the Parties, which is the body that's making decisions. And then there's like what I think of as the Greater Metropolitan COP, which is the event that draws tens of thousands of people. And you can have a different conclusion about those 2 COPs, but they are often conflated. And I think of Madrid as a classic example where the COP as official body really didn't reach agreement on finishing up the Paris rule book. And so one could have said, not so successful, but the greater COP was very successful, I would argue, because there were all kinds of commitments being taken on by companies and subnational governments and all of that. And if one looked at that, one might have said it was successful, but I don't think people got that nuance, even though it is a pretty important one. Second, challenge is that even looking at the formal COP as treaty body, it's very complicated. It's become very, very complicated. Institutionally, when you go to a COP, you've got 3 different treaty bodies meeting. You've got the original Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. You've got the subsidiary bodies. You've got all kinds of new bodies, constituted bodies, as they call them. You meet in formal session, you meet in informal session, and sometimes even in informal, if you can believe that that's a concept. So to try to keep track of that when you're not really steeped in it is almost impossible. And I would say substantively, it's also become much more complicated. Back in the day when I was working on the negotiation of the Framework Convention, we were essentially worried about mitigation, and a little bit on finance and some reporting. Adaptation was not a big issue. We didn't, now if you look at the COP agenda, you have many more issues and you have sub-issues of every one of those issues. And, we really have become very, very specialized. So even a person who's like negotiating might be a total expert in some, aspect of adaptation, but not really know much about mitigation, right? Okay, third. I think negotiators and the whole kind of process, the regime uses a language all its own. I think people speak in code. They kind of have to because it's become that kind of a thing. People speak in article numbers. They speak in acronyms. Even in Glasgow, people from the outside might have been following Article 6, quote unquote, which is the market mechanisms, but people on the inside would be talking about, well, wait, what do you mean? Are you talking about Article 6.2 or you are talking about Article 6.4? And by the way, there was also an Article 6.8, and those were all being negotiated in kind of somewhat separate tracks. So that just shows you how arcane the whole thing is. And the language also changes very quickly. And I recall that, at one point, the information you were supposed to supply when you handed in your Paris target to clarify what you were doing was called upfront information, or UFI. I turned around for like a day, and all of a sudden it was called information for clarity, transparency, and understanding, ICTU. And so, within the spin, and I was like a so-called expert in this stuff, and I even couldn't keep up with like my own subject. Fourth, the final deal making is done behind closed doors, and I think it has to be, or in the hallway. I mean, you just can't make a deal in public with 200 people. So at the end, the outside world sees the words, right? But it doesn't necessarily know what to do with them or what was behind them, and they're kind of at the mercy of finding out from someone on the inside, what was actually agreed and what were the pieces and why. The fifth is that, and this is relevant to the assessment of Copenhagen, as was mentioned, the assessment of the COP very much depends on your own metric or expectation. Take Copenhagen. I thought it was successful. I mean, I was on our delegation, so probably I was a little bit biased, but I totally understood why, if you were expecting a legally binding 100-page treaty, you would have looked at the 2 pages that came downstairs from upstairs, and you would have said, what? And it would have been considered a total disaster, which, it still is. I think, from my perspective, since we started thinking we would have no outcome, and we basically got the very first global agreement on 2 degrees as our target, we got all the major economies taking on commitments, we got a transparency regimes that applied to all parties, we had the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I thought at the time, wow, this is, a real progress has been made. And today I would argue all of the seeds of the Paris Agreement are, or most of them, in the Copenhagen Accord. But, it's very, who's right and who's wrong? There is no objective truth about the Copenhagen Accord, because it all depended on what you were expecting. Similarly, Glasgow, if you were expecting, the Glasgow conference in and of itself to put the world like 100% solidly on track to meet the 1.5 degree limit, you would say, oh my God, failure. If your expectation was that it would make, substantial progress in that direction and maybe finish the Paris rulebook, you would say, amazing. I think as a negotiator, I see how hard it is to get 200 countries to agree, especially when those countries have such different interests. You've got, islands existentially threatened by climate change itself, and you have oil exporting countries that are existentially threatened by the responses to climate change. And the notion, I sometimes get chills up my spine when I think that we just reached agreement among essentially billions of people to do something. I think, wow. And then I read a headline that says, conference was a failure. And I think, I guess you could see it from, both perspectives. Very quickly, so my 6th point is that the world essentially likes sound bites. It doesn't like nuance. It likes to see a assessment of a COP was it successful or not? Very, kind of binary. To get a considered analysis takes time, right? So that the think tanks, the organizations that are writing the thoughtful analysis of what actually happened at a COP, you can't do that instantly. It takes at least a few days. I know, because I used to write some of those myself for a think tank, and you cannot compete with the headline that comes out immediately, and that's what the world wants. So one of my pieces of advice, David, to answer your question finally, is I think people should take the time, maybe even close your eyes, don't read the headlines, wait a couple days, read some analysis that is not superficial, like yes, no, good, bad, and actually, come to your own view. The 7th is that press likes drama. So for example, Glasgow, most of the articles I read and the questions I got after the COP were all about the difference between phase out and phase down. That was like a microscopic aspect of the COP, in my opinion. It appeared at the very last minute. It was not a discussion really for 2 weeks. The UK put this language in at the last minute. 2 countries had an objection to it. It already said gradually phase out, which is not that different from phase down. So, but the press totally gravitated toward that as the story, because it was the thing that happened at the end and caused some drama. And I think that gives people a sense of the COP that was not really complete or, that meaningful. Last point, and then I'll shut up, is that I think the nature of COPs is changing. We're going from lots of negotiations to much less negotiating. And there's going to be a lot more kind of initiatives and probably commitments being taken on that are kind of outside the context of decision-making and negotiations. So it might be easier for outsiders to assess whether it was successful or not, because there's less of the jargon and Article 6 and all of that kind of stuff. But it might also be harder to judge because it's less binary. I mean, it's less, did they reach agreement on the Kyoto Protocol or not? That's easy to figure out. But, you know, did this thing make meaningful progress towards 1.5? Might be harder to figure out. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great insights from inside the room and inside the negotiations. Fred, for equally as long as Sue has been a negotiator, you have been one of these gatekeepers, writers, journalists, helping us in civil society make sense of it. What is your sense of how we do that in this increasingly complex environment?
Oh, it's pretty chaotic. I mean, I don't write the headlines, but I write the words that come under the headlines. So I'm guilty as charged. I love Sue's summing up or exposition on how these things work. That all rang very, very true to me. Look, whether it does depend greatly on your expectations, what you think comes out of these things. At NGOs, civil society needs to have its own agenda. You need to know what you're expecting to come out. You need to have sort of ways of measuring whether what comes out is what you wanted to come out. Politicians have to do the same thing, and then they have to answer to people like me. One of the questions I always like to ask negotiators before a conference is what success will look like and what failure would look like, because then you can turn up at the end and have some judgment about it. If you don't ask that question, they'll tell you it was a success anyway. But if you've asked what success was, you can hold them to some kind of account. And that's kind of my job, is to try and kind of ground truth, what people are saying. I thought what Sue said was very interesting about the sort of wider canvas of all this. I've been very struck, most notably at Glasgow, but before, about how there are there's the UN process of reaching an agreement of whatever sort. The Paris one, there wasn't, you know, it was just a kind of an accord coming out of Glasgow. It was bits and pieces. But alongside that UN process are all these other things, and it seems to me that increasingly they're taking over. So you have all the big announcements, all the things that I was writing about from Glasgow were about, you know, there's 100 nations or more have come up with a deal on forests. There's a deal on methane. You know, the US and China have reached an accord, something on electric vehicles, we're going to phase out or not phase out coal. And you have these coalitions of the willing with numbers that can go from 2 to 5 to 120. And it's quite hard to work out exactly what they're promising, because the wording is often very vague. It doesn't have the kind of sort of fine tuning that you would get from a UN negotiation. Now that it gives a sense of progress, but it's much harder to make a judgment about exactly what's come out of the conference when, you know, you haven't seen the small print, because there probably isn't any small print. They'll write that later. So it is difficult, but we have to, as a science journalist, I mean, I work really hard not just to look at the diplomacy, whether, you know, the politicians come out of it and declare success or whatever, or the NGOs come and say, no, it was a disaster, or whoever it is. And there are a huge range of different interpretations that come out of these things. So I will, like many people in Glasgow, we are saying, okay, we came into the conference with a prediction that what was on the table would deliver 2.7 degrees of warming, Celsius of warming. Well, that's not enough. We know we need to be below 2.2 degrees. And then all through the conference, people saying, well, maybe if all the promises are met, then we'll get to 1.9 or 2.4. There are all these different numbers coming out. So NGOs are in this game too. But look, it's a way of trying to measure. Now, at the end of the day, the COPs don't save a single ton of carbon. They put it into the atmosphere for everybody going to the conference. But so it's all diplomacy, and then it depends on whether people meet their promises, whether their promises that they thought that they made are anything like what everybody else thought they made. Exactly what does India mean when it says it's going to get to zero carbon by 2070? How is it going to measure that? There's a lot of imponderables in all this. So we're all fighting in this chaotic environment, but I think that's the nature of diplomacy. Diplomacy of all sorts has always been like that. At least here we have kind of scientists with models, and well, we just have thermometers. You know, we know how temperature's going up. We know how the CO2 levels are going up in the atmosphere. We have stuff to measure. So we at least have a way of measuring the overall progress. The mood music is harder to guess. I mean, coming back to Copenhagen just very briefly at the end, I remember I was a little tired. It was early in the morning. We'd all been up all day, but I remember Barack Obama and a whole load of other leaders holding press conferences at the end after they'd all been together for a day or so, and they announced success, and they all headed for their planes and got into their planes and flew home. And by the time they got home, the conference, accepting what Sue says about some of the incremental changes that were important that happened, but the conference itself as a final declaration had crashed. So they'd announced success because the leaders had agreed something, but when it went back to the conference floor, it all crashed again. So even the leaders don't know what's going on very often, let alone the rest of us.
Fred, let me ask you, if I can, let me for a minute sort of put you in Sue's role. If you are part of the government, how do you wrestle with the role and the responsibility of telling the truth to your public about what is happening in the COP process in a way that doesn't exaggerate and that holds up to scrutiny and to skepticism, but also is digestible and tells the story of what the government's trying to do and what they're wrestling with within the constraints that governments face in diplomacy?
Well, I hope it's not too hard. I mean, I hope you just actually do try and tell the truth. The problems tend to come when governments try to manipulate the information, or what typically happens, they'll settle on one particular small aspect and try and make out that this is the real big deal. And then, you know, so you can dress things up as a success, which aren't really a success. I thought Glasgow was reasonable in that regard, in that the British chairing the sessions went in with what I would say would be a relatively low expectation. Their phrase was they wanted to keep 1.5 alive. And I guess you would say that they managed to deliver that, but it would have been quite hard to sort of kill it off at that point, to be honest. But so some honesty, some realism about what can be achieved. Politicians that listen to their experts, listen to people like Sue telling them what is possible, what's not possible, rather than kind of grandstanding, that can help a lot. I don't think it's hard, actually. Yes, I know it's complicated. I know there's a lot of different aspects, but you know, the best way of being truthful is to be truthful.
And Sue, let me come back to you on that same question. You have for years helped communications teams for the United States, public diplomacy teams for the United States in the COP process think about how to communicate with the American people back home. But obviously you also have the delicate dance of the fact that this is a multilateral process. You are working with partners, you're pushing and prodding partners. And in some ways that sort of limits what you can say. How have you thought about that as you've counted what governments can and should say as you've counseled communications teams for years?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's that easy. You know, I'll give you a couple of reasons why. First of all, you know, when you say just tell the truth, I mean, that's not so easy when the question isn't really a matter of truth, but it's a matter more of what's your objective. So when you were saying, Fred, before a COP, you like to hold, you know, you like countries to tell you or governments to tell you exactly what they want and then hold them to it. Okay, here's a problem though. Let's say you know, or you suspect that in Glasgow, you're not going to actually, it's unrealistic to think that you're going to, as I said before, keep 1.5, you know, you absolutely be on a trajectory to 1.5, but that you're going to make substantial progress, okay? So what do you say is your goal publicly? You want to keep it very high because you don't want to, before the COP, radiate the fact that, you actually expect it to be less realistically, because then you probably will get less. So you want to keep it high and say, we want to use this COP to drive towards 1.5. Then someone like you says afterwards, aha, you didn't meet your objective, because, I think it puts governments actually in a very difficult position in terms of achieving their own objectives, and can end up sort of driving down ambition in that sense. So I think that's a challenge. I tend to counsel.
So could I just ask, if I can break in there? I mean, did you think that the British were wrong to kind of limit their expectation to keep 1.5 alive? I mean, they didn't say they were going to deliver it, that they might have done, or call on everybody to deliver it. It was just this lower bar, keep 1.5 alive, live to fight another day. Was that a mistake, do you think?
No, I liked keep it alive. We used to say keep 1.5 within reach or in sight or something like that. And I like that because it's more of a continuum and less of an absolute, right? So that's one. And I was going to say that I actually like the use of kind of adjectives and adverbs that give a little bit of flexibility there, for precisely so that you don't have to like undercut your own objectives before COP. The other thing that I think is challenging is like post-COP. As I mentioned before, we live in a world where everyone wants an instant analysis of how the COP. We literally are like just made some deal, and we have to figure out in 15 seconds before John Kerry walks out of the room, what is our assessment? And that's not so easy when you've got like dozens of pieces of paper, and we're having to like check with all of our team members on how did this come out? How did this come out? How did this come out? Like, what is our judgment? Nobody would stand for let's take a 24-hour pause so we can actually read through all the documents and tell you what our assessment is. Everybody wants to know right away. And I think that's quite challenging. I think in terms of my own, like in the past year, I've had to do a lot more, direct communicating than I did in the past when I was the lawyer and could, escape having to directly do the communications. But, one thing I think is important, and I hope increases the credibility of our team is, I think you lose credibility if you don't stick to what was actually agreed. And especially when it's like the words are on the page or it's a fact. And I give an example of, after Paris, in Paris, there was a decision that said that the parties are requested to come back in 2022 and, update their 2030 targets. I left the government after that, and there were a lot of NGOs and governments saying Paris decision requires parties to update, and anyone who doesn't do it, is like violating the Paris Agreement. But that's just not true. And people wanted me to say that that was true because they wanted to push that agenda. But I feel like that would like compromise my whatever credibility, either as an outsider or as the US government when I'm inside. And so I think it's important, like, even if people want you to be stronger, to say, what's actually the case. The way I dealt with that was basically by saying, the Paris Agreement doesn't require it, but the science requires it, or something like that, which, is like accurate and also forward leaning. I also think that even when it's not just a fact, but it's a matter of opinion, I still think it's good not to overstate the case. I think it improves credibility. When I listen to someone, let's just say, when I'm myself trying to assess the credibility of something, I always like it when someone acknowledges that they didn't get everything they wanted, or they do the sort of on the one hand and the other. I'm very into like on the one hand and the other hand, because I think it kind of increases the credibility of an assessment to say, well, we didn't get, we have not guaranteed 1.5. but we did make substantial progress. Or, the Global Methane Pledge, which was our initiative with the EU, got 110 countries. And people would say, like, does that guarantee saving 0.2 degrees centigrade of warming? You could say yes, but you could also say, if fully implemented, yes, right? And I think it increases the credibility because you're not like the piece of paper doesn't save, as you said, the piece of paper alone doesn't save 0.2 degrees. So I think as a communicator, it's good to put in the caveats. And I tend to trust sources more when they do acknowledge this and that, rather than kind of make a very non-nuanced statements. Thanks.
Really great insights. And, and hearing that, Sue, I'm with my old State Department hat back on for a second. I always remember something Secretary Kerry used to say heading into any negotiation, whether it was climate or other issues, was that sort of the day that you publicly stop talking about plan A, you let the other interlocutors take you very quickly to plan C or D, and that you have to sort of keep that public pressure on heading into something. So it's obviously, it is by definition a balancing act where the work of communications has to leave room for the art of diplomacy. Fred, I want to ask you, is the responsibility and the role of journalists. How do you, as a journalist, as a writer, as somebody who's helping bring the public into the COP process, how do you think about your balance of skepticism versus, taking public announcements by governments, by NGOs, by others? How do you strike that balance between what you feel is your responsibility to the truth, but also your responsibility to help the public understand what the players doing the negotiating are really trying to achieve?
I don't think there's a balance between those two. I mean, I try and report what's happening, really. I mean, I think journalists need to be quite humble about this. I mean, we're not in there. We're not players in there. We shouldn't be players in there. We are trying to give insights into what's happening. And that means turning up and, being a gumshoe and asking questions and trying to summarize what people tell you and then try and, ground truth it to some extent or complement it with what other people say. It's that's not all journalists are like. Some journalists are kind of op-ed writers or they have their own agendas, and that's fine. But if you're a reporter at a conference, you're basically turning up and saying, okay, what's happening today? Who's doing what today? What's interesting? What are the big players doing? What are they, what's China saying? What's India saying? What are the US saying? What's the EU saying? Are they agreeing? Are they disagreeing? What's exercising people? So I spend quite a lot of time in bars trying to find people who will tell me, yeah, but did you know that behind the scenes we were really sweating about this? You try and build up a picture. In a complex conference, it's very difficult. You have to keep to the essentials. It's quite difficult to describe the nuances. You have to try and do it. I think it's important to give people an impression, at any rate, of the complexity and the nuance and the fact that people aren't going to get everything that they want. And if they claim to have got everything they want, they're probably lying to you. As a science journalist, I mean, that's the diplomatic side, if you like, people getting what they want, who won, who lost. On the scientific side, you're then trying to ground truth. How far is this taking us to what the scientists perhaps tell us is the other goals that we need to reach? Or the scientists don't really tell us what we should do, but if you want to achieve this, this is the way to do it, or this is what you need to be looking for. So, that's what you try and do. It's a pretty humble job, but quite a difficult job. And at the end of the day, you write 1,500 words and then somebody writes a 7-word headline to try and sum it all up. And so, there are levels of simplification that go on right to the point where somebody writes the headline. And a lot of stuff gets lost along the way, but you kind of hope that some essence survives beyond just saying it was a success or it was a failure or China won or India lost or whatever it was. All those things matter and are significant. But, I suppose I don't want people to get too cynical about the process. I'm a skeptic in the correct sense of the word, in that I always want to question whatever I'm told. I don't want to take anything on trust. But I hope you'll take the distinction between a skeptic and a cynic. My view, a skeptic is somebody who will ask the hard question and is ready to be convinced. A cynic is somebody who may or may not ask the questions, but certainly doesn't want to be convinced. So I'm a good skeptic.
Can I just add something, David?
Of course.
Yeah, I think there is kind of an assumption out there, maybe it's inherent in your question, that like governments are not necessarily credible civil society is credible. And, I haven't found that. I mean, some civil society is credible and some civil society has an interest or a motivation for putting out a particular narrative, just as a government might. I think of Glasgow, where a couple of the NGOs held a press conference and, condemned the United States for opposing X. Okay. Luckily a journalist called to say, is it true that the United States is opposing X? And it was actually an issue I was working on. So I said, what? We're not opposing X at all. We were just in a meeting where we supported X. I have no idea where that came from, right? But in general, I think there is more of a tendency to think the government is going to say something, not credible, and we have to go to the NGO as the source of the truth. I don't think it's as simple as that.
I agree with that. In my experience, NGOs change their what they're saying during conferences much more than governments. They flip between, or not all of them, but many of them flip between claiming success and saying it's all turning to disaster on really the very flimsiest of bases. Often up until the very last moment, they want to claim it's going to be a disaster, and then right at the end they say, well, actually, no, we got quite a lot out of this. We're really pleased, and roll on the next conference. So we have to. It's a very dangerous assumption. I've had conversations with people at the BBC and other people about this. It's a very dangerous consumption, especially in the world of the environment, to kind of think that the NGOs are the good guys and the policymakers are the bad guys. It's a very dangerous shorthand.
And there's always that game of telephone that's happening in this sort of hothouse environment where it's amazing how rumors, often unfounded, spread. We have some great questions coming in from the audience. I would love to start with one from Debbie Rosen. And Sue, I'd love to throw this one to you. Debbie was asking, how do you see the role of science in informing the COP negotiations and the outcomes, especially some of the recent IPCC reports? Or do you see it more primarily as a diplomatic and political exercise, more than one grounded in science? I was always struck by how much you and Secretary Kerry had to understand not just the diplomacy, but to be really deep and in the weeds on the science itself. How do you think about that, Sue?
I think it informs the COP process a lot. And just to give one well, first of all, it informed as Fred said, the original framework convention said that the point was to avoid, quote, dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And it wasn't really reduced to a number for several years. And it's one of the reasons I say that the Copenhagen Accord had some good things in it. It's the first time that the world agreed to, or most of the world agreed to, the below 2 degrees as a quantification of dangerous anthropogenic interference. And over the, if you look at the incremental change in the temperature goal, it's very much been driven by science, in particular the IPCC reports, where you went from, below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees, and then in Paris, well below 2 degrees, while pursuing 1.5, the limit of 1.5. And you'd think that would be the end of the story. Not at all. Part of Paris was to commission another IPCC report on 1.5. And as a result of that study and a couple of the other more specific ones, like on the ocean and cryosphere, that's kind of what drove the leaning into 1.5 that was so evident in Glasgow. Like Paris was only finished a handful of years ago, and Glasgow was all about not changing literally the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, but basically saying acknowledging that the difference between impacts at 2 or well below 2 and 1.5 is huge. We really need to lean into 1.5 and do everything necessary to keep it alive, or whatever you want to say. So that's I think a perfect example of how advances in science and science assessment have had a direct impact on the COP process.
Let me, and Fred, a question that came in that I think will probably resonate with some of your work, going back and documenting so many of the past COPs. How much do you think we need more and deeper sort of climate change policy historiography so that younger generations can feel optimistic about all the progress that has been made, from COP1 all the way through COP26? Or do you think that would sort of distract from the bolder expectation and the demands of young people today, which is often a forcing function for progress in itself?
Yeah, I feel pretty conflated about that, because when you've seen a lot and you've experienced quite a lot of this stuff, you do have a certain perspective. But I'm aware that when I say things like I'm impressed at how much progress has been made since the 80s or the 90s, or maybe if you told me in 1992 we'd have got this far by 2022, I wouldn't have believed you, and I think I wouldn't have believed that. But is that complacency? Is that, I suspect it probably is a little bit. I actually think a shorter time perspective can be very useful. The anger of young people today about climate change and their refusal to accept the things that Sue and I are saying, well, we've made progress and that was important. And, you need that. You really do need that, because otherwise, stuff doesn't happen. It falls off the politicians' agenda. They need to be sweating a bit when they go into that conference room. If they think that they can just turn up and go through the negotiating procedures and go home and everybody will be happy, then it takes the pressure off. So I think you need both, to be honest. You really do need you do need a sense of the historical perspective, especially if you've had a bad day and you think, oh, what was that about, or a whole bad conference. You need to have that sense of, well, actually progress has been made, but you've got to remain impatient, because the stakes here are really, really high, and that's, as Sue was saying, that's what the science is telling us more and more about. We don't know everything about climate change, but everything that we learn seems to make it scarier, and more as a kind of all-embracing issue. I mean, I'm impressed because, in our day-to-day lives, well, okay, we see a few more wildfires and the temperature goes up for a few days somewhere and it looks a bit scary. But most of us in our day-to-day lives, we don't kind of experience in any visceral sense climate change. There are many other pressures, even on sort of, nice middle-class people like us without any huge concerns. There are still other pressures on us which look greater than climate change. So, wow, I'll stick with it. I'm actually impressed at how far science and civil society have been able to push politicians to keep this on the agenda and to keep journalists like me writing about it. I mean, it's a tough one. Climate change is quite a tough topic to write about because it doesn't change instantly. The diplomacy moves on a bit, but climate change, well, what we're saying is more or less what we were saying 5 years ago. How do you make that news? How do you keep talking about that? How do you keep people interested? So I'm kind of impressed still about how we've gone on, but we need that impatience too.
And I want to make sure we get through as many questions as we can in the 10 minutes or so that we have left. Sue, one that just came in from Jane Fonda that I think is right in your wheelhouse and is one that I know you've thought a lot about. In the case of some of the petrol states that have economies entirely based on fossil fuels, obviously they have huge anxiety that if they join the transition or accelerate the transition away from it, they're going to be unable to fund basic social services for their populations. Where do you see the public finance issues going in a way that the world can credibly say to countries that if they make that transition, if they give up fossil fuels over time, they're not going to give up the economic power at home that has come with it? And where do you see the work going on that?
Thanks. I mean, I don't feel like an expert on that subject. I can just say that in terms of the negotiations, the positions of those countries have changed dramatically. So 30 years ago, I would say that the position of those countries was essentially fight off a treaty-based regime you know, as strongly as possible. Delay, obstruct, you know, because it was considered sort of existential, just like climate change was to other countries. I think more recently, those countries, even though they're not like necessarily in the progressive group in the climate negotiations, are taking action at home that's quite interesting and impressive. I mean, I went with Secretary Kerry to Saudi Arabia, for example, over the summer and listened to a 7-hour presentation by essentially the oil minister or energy minister on everything that Saudi Arabia is doing to change its energy mix. And I think they're like definitely have moved beyond trying to stop this movement and are now trying to adjust to it. And I would say the same is true of many of the countries in the Middle East and part of the, you know, the OPEC group. So I think that's all, you know, a really interesting development. Thanks.
Great. No, and it was interesting to hear President Biden last week in his overall assessment of Russia. Obviously, you have an immediate crisis, but how much he noted that even though that's a fossil fuel economy to a large extent, even for a country like Russia, they're seeing and feeling with the permafrost melting, climate issues feel much more relevant in a way that they can't ignore for the long term. I want to go to 2 questions, and Fred, we'll start with you, but you should both feel free to take these. A question from Bonnie and a question from Tanya that kind of come from opposite ends of the spectrum, but sort of ask the same question. Bonnie asks, obviously, to some extent, we were all speaking to the choir. What do we do about the climate change deniers? How do we speak to those who haven't joined it? And Tanya, from her experience, you know, working among students who are incredibly passionate about this issue, but who expect instant news, instant answers, and that is the way that they are hardwired about this issue, probably in part because it feels so existential for their generation. How do we talk to that population, and how do we talk to the people at the opposite end of the spectrum? Fred, why don't we start with you?
Oh, that's really hard. I always answer questions like that by saying, well, we start by listening. Okay, what are their concerns? Why do deniers, if we can use that word, really not believe in climate change? Is it that they're unconvinced by the science? On a hard line, I'd say, well, which bit of the science don't you agree with? And that usually stumps them. But probably it has to do with, I mean, usually it means it doesn't kind of fit their worldview in some sense. It might be from an economic perspective, sort of free market kind of people who don't really want the kind of sort of big government that seems to be involved in some of this stuff. Or it may be, you know, skepticism about big government in some other form. Okay, well, let's get under the skin. Let's ask them what really concerns them, see if we can find a way in. I mean, young people, I kind of want to harness that impatience rather than dampen it down. But you know, as we talked about, there are uses of having these long-term perspectives. You can only go so far. I mean, people come at these things from their own perspective, and they will pick and choose the bits of information and the bits of perspective that they want. And that's how, you know, that's how plural societies work and how democracies work. So I'm not too much in the business of trying to kind of sort of browbeat people into taking a different view. I just want to put, you know, I'll stand back and be a reporter and put the stuff out there and hope that they'll pick it up. But I will certainly try and present it in a way that will meet their interests and concerns.
Great. Sue, how have you thought in the context of the COP process about trying to reach people who are skeptical, to be able to broaden that coalition of the willing?
Well, I would say, you know, in my 30 years or whatever more of working on this issue really at more the international level than at the domestic level, what's been interesting to see is that we are one of the few countries where climate change is still a partisan issue, very partisan. Most countries, there may be differences about exactly how to respond to climate change. You know, several Australian governments have fallen over the issue of, you know, should there be a carbon tax or should there be a cap and trade, right? Which is like, what is the measure you should use to respond to climate change, but not about really, is climate change an issue? And for us, it's been, we've actually gone kind of backwards, interestingly. I mean, usually there's a problem or a partisan divide, and you kind of go in the direction of more common view of an issue. In this, in my world, it's kind of gone backwards. If you think back to the UN Framework Convention of 1992, the Senate passed it basically unanimously. The only complaints about it were from senators like John Kerry and Al Gore, who said it's not strong enough. But it wasn't, Republicans were, as long as they were assured that the target was not in and of itself legally binding, they were fine. And, that's a treaty that had the words United Nations in it and climate change. That's hard to imagine today. And so I feel, and it was not really a cultural war issue back in 1992 or whatever, when we had to get this treaty approved. What's been very challenging, difficult for like me and company as climate negotiators, lawyers, et cetera, for the United States is having to straddle the domestic world where it is so partisan and where there are a lot of either deniers or people who do not want to take action, and match that up with the international demands on the United States, which are huge, because for the longest time we were the largest emitter until China overtook us, and other countries expected us to kind of live up to a particular standard of emission reduction, and also to financial assistance to the countries that needed it. And both of those require congressional approval, pretty much, deep cuts in the United States and appropriations. And we were not necessarily always able to guarantee those. So we have had to, in a way, it made my work interesting as the lawyer, having to figure out how exactly to do that straddle, right, through a combination of different tools. But it's made it, I would say, much more challenging for us than for other countries where there's more of a kind of consensus about the problem.
Great. And Sue, this will be the last question. George from the audience noticed that you actually had Republican delegations attending this last COP, people like Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. And it was something that George took as a positive, given that for recent years, this issue had unfortunately been trending partisan. Why is that kind of bipartisan presence on the ground at a COP important? And what do you think is a reasonable hope for moving towards greater bipartisan representation at the next COP?
Yes, Lisa Murkowski was in the Senate delegation, and we did do a briefing for the Senate delegation. So it's obviously good for Republicans to see what's going on at the COP, even if they, I don't know in her case whether she liked what she saw or didn't, but even if people don't like what they see, it's still good for them to be sort of educated about what's going on. But it was also important for her to be there to give a sense to other countries, because they met with a lot of other countries, including China, to give a sense to other countries that, this is not a totally partisan issue, and that there are Republican senators and members of the House that care about the issue in some way. So I think it is very important for them to show up, even if they don't agree with the administration necessarily.
Great. And Fred, any closing thoughts on your end?
Not really. It's all still up for grabs, isn't it? I mean, it is a very chaotic world that we live in, and Sue's described the different pulls on things very well. And I mean, there are skeptics everywhere, and they're deniers. Some of them are more vocal in some places than others, and America is nothing if not vocal on these issues. But you go to India, you find a lot of people who will of course say, we want to develop. We don't, you rich world, you created this problem, you solve it. That remains a very strong narrative, and it has debates about climate justice and about loss and damage and all these kind of issues which come up at the conference are going to remain very important, because there are huge issues of inequality between nations, which are going to play out as well. So, there's international discord as well as national discord. It makes it a great story. It's going to see me out for sure.
Well, let's hope this great story has a great ending.
I hope so.
And on that note, as far as climate goes, to be continued. And Tom, do you want to take us away?
Yes, actually. Thank you so much. I would again like to extend a round of applause to our moderator, David Wade, and our two conversationalists, Suzanne Binyaz and Fred Pierce. Just one more note. I would again like to reiterate that we were under Chatham House rules, meaning that you are free to use the information that you learned from this discussion, but you may not attribute it to any participant or speaker, nor may you say where you obtained it. So in the parlance, obviously nothing is legally binding. So everyone will also receive a follow-up email in about a week or so with some summarizing remarks. And please do keep an eye out for some announcements about some of the upcoming events in this speaker series, including upcoming events about communicating environmental values in the outdoor recreation industry and communicating financial risks on climate change. And again, thank you so much. It was a wonderful discussion.
Thanks, everybody.